A Guide to Growing Spinach. This dark leafy green originated from Persia and is a staple in salads and sandwiches. Spinach can be eaten both raw and cooked and boasts a ton of nutritional benefits, like high levels of vitamin C. When raw, it tastes sweeter and milder. After it's cooked, spinach gets a more acidic and robust flavor. Spinach varieties. There are two types of regular spinach, smooth leaf and SAVOY leaf. The SAVOY types have more texture, but soil and sand tend to catch in the crinkles of their leaves. Crinkled leaf. Bloomsdale Longstanding, a thick, crinkly variety with glossy dark green leaves. It typically takes 48 days to mature. Winter Bloomsdale. This variety is slow to bolt, tolerant to cucumber mosaic virus, cold tolerant, and good for overwintering. It's harvest ready in about 45 days. Hybrid SAVOY. Indian Summer. Resistant to some downy mildew and tolerant to spinach blight. This variety takes 39 days to mature. Melody. A lightly crinkled variety that's resistant to downy mildew and as good as a spring or fall crop. It takes 42 days to reach maturity. Taiyi. A dark green, heavily SAVOYed variety that's tolerant to downy mildew. It takes 39 days to mature. Vienna. A medium to long-standing variety that's heavily SAVOYed. It's also tolerant to downy mildew as well as spinach blight. Vienna spinach matures in 40 days. Plain leaf. Giant Noble. This long-standing variety has large, smooth leaves and matures in 43 days. Plain leaf hybrid. Olympia. A slow-bolting variety best for a spring or summer harvest. It matures in 46 days. Spinach is mainly started by seeds, and direct sowing is typically the best option. Before starting, soak the spinach seeds in water overnight. This will soften the seed coats and speed up germination. Once they're ready, sow the seeds a ½ inch, 0.75 centimeters deep, spaced 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters apart, in rows that are 12 to 18 inches, 30 to 45 centimeters apart. Seeds can also be scattered across a wider area. Spinach's optimal soil temperature is between 5 to 20 degrees Celsius, 45 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit, with a day length of about 12 hours. Typically, seeds will germinate within 5 to 9 days. It also helps to use a floating row cover to protect the seedlings from cold weather and insects. Once the weather has warmed, remove the row cover or replace it with a more lightweight one. That way, the plants won't be exposed to too much heat, and a lightweight cover will continue to protect the plants from flea beetles and leaf miners. Note: spinach seeds don't store well, so fresh seeds should be bought every year. Soil conditions. Spinach thrives in well-drained, fertile soil that's high in organic matter. Their soil also needs lots of consistent moisture. Typically, spinach tolerates slightly alkaline soils, but it can be sensitive to acidic soils. So ideally, its soil pH should be at least 6.0, but preferably in the 6.5 to 7.5 range. Thinning. Overcrowding plants stunts their growth and encourages plants to bolt. To avoid crowding, thin spinach seedlings to 4 to 6 inches, 10 to 15 centimeters apart, once they have at least 2 true leaves. Watering. Spinach is a quick-growing, shallow-rooted crop that isn't tolerant of water stress. It's important to maintain enough moisture by frequently watering when needed, but avoid watering practices that splashes soil onto the leaves or otherwise damages them. Weeding. Frequent shallow cultivation with a hoe or another tool will kill any weeds before they become a problem. Just be careful not to damage the plants when cultivating. Temperatures. Mature spinach plants can tolerate temperatures as cold as 20 degrees Fahrenheit, -6 degrees Celsius. But protect them from freezing weather by covering their bed with a portable plastic tunnel or row cover. Spinach will bolt in temperatures that are greater than 75 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius. So if the weather warms up, try protecting the spinach under shade cloth set over a frame. Fertilizer. Spinach is a heavy feeder and thrives in rich soil. Dig in 1/4 to 1/2 cup of a complete organic fertilizer beneath every 3 feet, 1 meter of row. Fertilize with compost tea, fish emulsion, or cottonseed meal once the plants have about 4 true leaves. Mulching. Add herbicide-free grass clippings, weed-free straw, or other organic material to a depth of 3 to 4 inches. This mulch layer can help prevent weed growth, which reduces the need for frequent cultivation. Spinach grows well with celery, carrots, brassicas, eggplants, leeks, lettuce, peas, radish, and strawberries. Cucumbers, mint, and garlic are also great companions. The great news is that spinach doesn't have any garden adversaries. Raised beds. Raised beds are a great option to use. Just make sure they're raised at least 6 to 8 inches above the existing soil. Mix a minimum of 2 to 4 inches of compost into the row before planting. Spinach plants form a deep taproot, so for best growth, loosen the soil at least 1 foot deep before planting. Containers. Another great option, but only allow 1 plant for each 8-inch pot. In large containers, plant spinach on 10-inch centers. Since spinach is heat sensitive, it also helps to move the containers into the shade on hot days. Baby's leaf hybrid and Melody varieties grow especially well in containers. Aphids. These tiny pests come in a variety of colors: green, black, red, light orange, or yellow, and mainly feed on the undersides of leaves and stems. What they're actually feeding on is the sap in plants, which ends up causing the plants damage. Aphids also leave behind a sticky substance called honeydew, and they are a pest that's known to spread diseases. Aphids can be tolerated by most plants when their numbers are low, but if there's a lot of aphids, they can stunt a plant's growth and cause a plant's leaves to turn yellow and fall off. Here's what to do. For the most part, plants can handle mild aphid infestations. But if they're found, a strong jet of water from a garden hose will wash them off the plants. Spraying plants with water should be done early in the morning so that the plants can dry off during the day. Sticky traps, neem oil, insecticidal soaps, and horticultural oils are also effective against aphids. Just be sure to follow the application instructions on the packaging. Oftentimes, you can also get rid of aphids by wiping or spraying the leaves with a mild solution of water and a few drops of dish soap. One variation includes adding a pinch of cayenne pepper. Soapy water should be reapplied every 2 to 3 days for about 2 weeks. As well, you can try to attract beneficial insects like lady beetles, hoverflies, and lacewings, all of which are important aphid predators. Make sure to check all transplants for aphids before planting. And keep in mind that aphids aren't very mobile, so it's not uncommon to find one heavily affected plant surrounded by plants that are fine. If this is the case, simply remove and destroy the infected plant. Armyworms. Armyworms are green, reddish, or black caterpillars that heavily feed on the leaves of plants, turning them into skeleton leaves that are filled with lots of irregular or circular-shaped holes. These pests are most active in the early morning and the late evening, which are the best times to check for damage. Here's what to do. You can use natural enemies like wasps and flies to help keep armyworms in check. Also, if you're using insecticides, it's best to do so in the twilight hours. This is when those insecticides will be the most effective. It's also important to control the growth of weeds because they serve as cover for armyworms. Finally, you can simply hand-pick any armyworms off the plants. Cabbage looper. Light to dark green caterpillars with wavy white lines on their back and sides, and a distinctive arch in their back when they move. They feed on the leaves of a plant, which is also where they hide, causing ragged, large holes to appear. The damage they cause to plants is often quite severe. Here's what to do. Looper numbers are usually held in check by their natural enemies, other insects. If they do become problematic, loopers can be hand-picked from the plants. You can also apply certain safe bacteria, which effectively kills the younger larvae, as well as insecticidal soaps. Just try to avoid using chemical sprays because they will also damage helpful insects. Weeds attract and shelter these pests, so it's also important to keep weed growth under control. Pests can also be prevented and controlled by using row cover/insect netting when sowing or transplanting. As well, be sure to quickly remove any crop residue after harvest to prevent the looper from having a place to survive in over the winter. Leaf miners. Leaf miners are small dark flies with triangular yellow markings that start out as yellow maggots. They feed on the leaves of a plant, creating irregular, round-shaped mines/tunnels on the leaves. These mines/tunnels are long and narrow at first, but eventually will become an irregular-shaped, light-colored patch. This damage can stunt the growth of plants and cause the leaves of plants to turn yellow and drop. In extreme cases, severely infected seedlings can also die off completely. Here's what to do. Monitor plants for signs of these pests, paying close attention to the undersides of leaves. Typically, leaf miners can be removed using a stream of water in the early morning, and certain sprays are good to use too. Natural predators like ladybugs and parasitic wasps can also be attracted to keep leaf miners away. But if these pests are spotted on any plants, simply pick the bugs off and then carefully remove any damaged leaves. Insect netting can also be used to prevent leaf miners from attacking any plants. As well, keep in mind that soils should be plowed under immediately after harvest if any crops were infected with leaf miners. Spinach crown mite. These pests are tiny and transparent, living deep in the crown of a spinach plant. They cause leaves to become deformed and leave small holes in newly formed leaves. Spinach crown mites are a problem both for young seedlings and for older plants. Here's what to do. Hot pepper wax or insecticidal soaps can be effective ways to help get rid of these pests. As well, be sure to destroy any crop debris immediately after harvest. Slugs and snails. These slimy pests are either hard-shelled or soft, and they are nocturnal creatures who feed on the leaves and stems of a plant during the night. The feeding damage from these pests leaves irregular-shaped holes behind. Leaves can also be shredded or eaten entirely, and there will also be slime trails on nearby rocks, plants, and walkways. These pests thrive in damp conditions, damage a plant's growth, and also affect a plant's ability to form roots. Here's what to do. Wet conditions encourage slugs and snails. So, although it's important to keep the soil moist, it's just as important not to overwater any plants. As well, avoid overhead watering and keep any organic waste away from plants. If possible, hand-pick any slugs or snails at night, which is when those pests are most active. Beer traps are another way to handle a snail or slug problem. For this, dig a hole in the ground and place a large cup or bowl into the hole. It's best to use something with steep sides so that the slugs can't crawl back out when they're done, like a mason jar. Fill the jar about half full with beer and let it sit overnight. In the morning, the jar should then be full of drowned slugs that can then be flushed down the toilet. Another option is to place a barrier of diatomaceous earth, a natural powder made up of the skeletons of tiny aquatic creatures, around plants to keep snails and slugs away. Anthracnose. Small water-soaked spots will appear on a plant's leaves, and eventually those spots will get bigger and turn tan or brown in color with a papery texture. This disease thrives in extremely wet weather, and its spores are usually spread by splashing water. It can grow on any part of a plant, except for on the plant's roots. Here's what to do. Plant disease-resistant seeds when possible, and practice good crop rotation. In general, a 3-year rotation is a good place to start. As well, avoid using sprinklers or overhead irrigation, and water plants from their base to keep leaves as dry as possible. As well, seeds can be treated with hot water prior to planting, 122 degrees Fahrenheit or 50 degrees Celsius for 25 minutes. If anthracnose is found on any plants, make sure to destroy and compost the crop residue after harvest. As well, make sure to follow recommended spacing guidelines, since air circulation and ventilation is important for avoiding a lot of diseases. Finally, when planting in containers, it's important to sterilize those containers before use. Damping off. This is one of the most common problems when starting plants from seed. Seedlings will emerge and appear healthy. Then suddenly they'll wilt and die for no obvious reason. Damping off is caused by a fungus that thrives in moist conditions, and when soil and air temperatures are above 68 degrees Fahrenheit. It can also thrive when soils have too much nitrogen fertilizer. This fungus favors slow-growing, deeply seeded plants. The stems of affected plants become water-soaked and will eventually collapse, while roots become too water-soaked and damaged to function. Older plants can also be affected, and either those older plants become stunted or they will collapse. Damping off can be spread 3 different ways, either in water, by contaminated soil, or on gardening equipment. Here's what to do. When possible, plant disease-free seeds. Keep seedlings moist, but avoid overwatering the seedlings to keep the soil from getting too wet. And try to keep the soil from getting too cold. Raised beds are usually a great option for planting, since raised beds help with drainage. Also, avoid over-fertilizing seedlings, and thin the seedlings out to avoid overcrowding, and to make sure the seedlings are getting good air circulation. If containers are being used, those containers should be thoroughly washed in soapy water and then rinsed in a 10% bleach solution after each use. If any plants are affected with damping off, remove them from the garden and then practice a crop rotation of 2 to 3 years. Downy mildew. This fungal disease thrives in cool, humid climates. At first, downy mildew causes leaves to turn yellow, typically starting from the main vein, then spreading outward. Fungal spores that are grayish, purple, fuzzy spots will then grow on the undersides of leaves. Downy mildew typically affects young, tender leaves, and severe infections can also cause curled and distorted leaves. Sometimes those affected leaves can then become dehydrated and then drop from the plant entirely. When seedlings are affected, their growth is stunted, and downy mildew can also reduce crop yields while acting as an entry point for other diseases. When older plants are affected, in addition to the lesions they get, they will also seem more rigid and narrow as compared to healthy plants. Here's what to do. Plant drought-resistant varieties when possible. Practice good crop rotation. Ensure good air circulation around plants. And water plants early in the morning. This last tip gives the plants enough time to dry out during the day, making those plants less vulnerable to infection. Downy mildew is usually spread when leaves are wet for too long, so it also helps to avoid overhead watering. As well, be sure to keep weeds from growing. Once plants have downy mildew, the best thing to try is to eliminate moisture and humidity around the infected plants. If possible, try to improve their air circulation through selective pruning. In general, downy mildew normally clears itself up in an outdoor garden once the weather warms up, since it doesn't do well in warm temperatures. Also, if there are any infected plants, be sure to remove all crop remains after harvest to avoid reinfection, since this fungus can survive in crop residue. Keep in mind, too, that downy mildew is much easier to control when a plant's leaves and fruit are kept protected by a copper spray. Copper treatments can begin 2 weeks before the disease normally appears, and when a long period of wet weather is in store. Copper treatments can also start when the disease first appears. Then those treatments can be repeated at 7 to 10-day intervals for as long as the treatments are needed. Harvesting. Within 6 to 8 weeks, harvesting can begin from any plant with leaves that are at least 3 to 4 inches long. To keep producing, harvest by pinching off the outer leaves once they're big enough to use. It's important to avoid harvesting more than 50% of the leaves from a single plant. But to harvest the entire plant, simply cut it at its base and remove the older leaves. For regrowth, leave about an inch below the leaves before clipping off the stems. Storage. Store spinach in its ideal conditions, at a temperature around 32 degrees Fahrenheit, with 95 to 100% relative humidity. Spinach is very perishable, so it can only be stored for about 10 to 14 days. Storage temperature should be as close to 32 degrees Fahrenheit as possible, since spinach will deteriorate faster at higher temperatures.